When we think of Africa, what exactly are we picturing? A place on a map? Or is it an idea, a story that's been told to us over and over? Today, we're diving into a really challenging book by philosopher V.Y. Mudimbe called The Invention of Africa. And trust me, it's designed to make you question pretty much everything you think you know.
We're kicking things off with this quote because it just cuts right to the heart of the issue. The idea here is that there's no single objective Africa. Instead, there are these competing stories, competing legends. So the real question becomes, who gets to write the official story? And which one do we end up believing?
So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll tackle this idea of how Africa was invented and look at the colonial system that locked that idea in place. Then, we'll flip the script and explore the powerful response from African thinkers, which sparked this incredible debate about what African philosophy even is. And finally, we'll see what this all tells us about the nature of knowledge itself.
Okay, let's get right into it. What on earth does Mudimbe mean when he says a whole continent was invented? So Mudimbe's main argument is this. The image of Africa that most of us have in our heads isn't some organic, self-grown reality. Nope. He says it's a concept, a construct that was largely built from the outside in by Western explorers, missionaries, and scholars over centuries, often to serve their own purposes.
And this whole process started way, way earlier than you might think. Take a look at this painting from 1508 by Hans Bergmair. It's meant to show African people, but Mudimbe points out something fascinating. Their bodies, their poses, they follow classical European ideals. He calls them blackened whites. It's such a powerful visual of how Africa was being viewed not on its own terms, but through a totally Western lens.
Now, to really grasp what was being ignored or written over, Mudimbe uses this specific term, gnosis. He's intentionally using the Greek word for to know, to talk about the entire universe of African knowledge. We're talking wisdom, traditions, cosmology, the whole shebang. It's so much broader than the very strict text-based thing the West tends to call philosophy. This is the stuff that the invention of Africa tended to erase. Okay, so how was this invention actually built and maintained? Mudimbe says it wasn't random. It was a systematic project he calls the colonizing structure.
For Mudimbe, you have to understand that colonialism wasn't just a physical takeover with soldiers and flags, it was an intellectual takeover. The colonizing structure was this whole project of reorganizing non-European societies, their economies, their politics, and, critically, their very systems of knowledge, to make them fit a European model. And in doing so, he says, it created these marginal societies, kind of trapped between their own past and a future that was imposed on them.
So who were the authors writing the books in this colonial library, so to speak? Well, it started with the explorers, right? Their travel diaries came back filled with so-called proof of stereotypes. Then came the missionaries, whose whole goal was to replace traditional beliefs. And finally, you get the anthropologists who arrived to study African societies almost like specimens, as objects to be cataloged, often framing them within theories that put Europe at the very top of human development. What's really telling is that even when Western theories disagreed about colonialism, they often shared the same blind spot. You had Marxists who saw it as a deliberate phase of capitalism. You had others who saw it as a more accidental result of industrial growth. But here's Mudimbe's point. Both theories have a Europe-centric focus. In both stories, Africa is just this passive place where Western history happens. And this brings us to an absolutely perfect, mind-bending example of this clash of knowledge systems, the case of the Dogon people in Mali. It is a genuine mystery. How in the world did they have incredibly specific astronomical knowledge that Western science only figured out with powerful telescopes in the 19th and 20th centuries?
I mean, just look at this list. The Dogon knew Sirius had a companion star no one could see. They said its orbit was 50 years. The actual scientific measurement is 50.04 years. That's insane. They described it as super dense and heavy, made of a metal not from Earth. This is a dead-on description of a white dwarf star, something Western science needed advanced astrophysics to even begin to comprehend.
So, how do you explain it? Well, the famous astronomer Carl Sagan came up with a hypothesis. He basically pictured a European traveler, maybe an adventurer or an anthropologist, visiting the Dogon sometime in the 1930s.
This visitor hears the local myths about Sirius, and in turn shares the latest Western astronomical facts about Sirius's companion star. Sagan suggested that this new info just got woven into the Dogon's traditional stories. But for Mudimbe, this explanation is the problem itself. He sees Sagan's theory as a textbook case of what he calls epistemological ethnocentrism. It's this deep-seated Western assumption, this will to truth, that just can't accept that such advanced knowledge could have an independent, non-Western origin. The impulse is always to explain it away, or, well, claim it came from the West in the first place.
And this leads us to a huge turning point in the story. What happens when the object of all this study and observation starts to speak for itself? This is the rise of the African counter-discourse.
This response started way back in the 19th century with thinkers like Edward Wilmot Blyden, who talked about the uniqueness of the African personality. Then it really picked up steam with the Negritude movement, led by giants like Aimé Césaire and Leopold Senghor, who were all about celebrating Black identity. And then, after independence, you get a whole new wave of philosophers who started taking apart the very ideas the Colonial Library had built, piece by piece.
You have to hear this quote from Blyden, from 1888 of all times. It is just so sharp. He's directly attacking that evolutionary idea of his era, the notion that all cultures are on one single path, and Europe's just at the front of the line. He's saying, no, that's wrong. Think of it as parallel lines, distinct but equal.
So this counter-discourse kicked off this really profound, really intense debate, not about politics, but among African thinkers themselves, about the very definition of philosophy.
Now here's a key and, frankly, very controversial term you need to know: ethno-philosophy. This was a label given to works, often by European missionaries, that tried to boil down the traditions of an entire people, like the Bantu, into a single collective philosophy. But the critics slammed this, saying, that's not real philosophy, that's just a fiction you've projected onto us.
So the debate really came down to this: what actually counts as philosophy? On one side, you have thinkers like Paulin Houtenji, who argue that philosophy is a science. It has to be written down, it has to be critical, and it has to be a debate between individual thinkers. A collective, unspoken worldview, he said, doesn't make the cut. But on the other side, people argue that philosophy absolutely can be a shared system of thought, a vital force that you find embedded in a culture's traditions and myths. This wasn't just an academic squabble. This was a fight for the intellectual soul of post-colonial Africa. All right, and this brings us to our final and maybe most important point. Mudimbe's work isn't really just about Africa. It's about knowledge itself. The big takeaway here, the thing to really chew on, is that the invention of Africa is a case study for something universal. It forces us to ask some really tough questions. How is any knowledge created? How do power and history and the very language we use end up defining what we accept as truth versus what we dismiss as myth? Mudimbe brings in other thinkers, like the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who is getting at a similar idea. This quote is basically saying that the fundamental wiring for complex thought is universal in humans. It's not just a reflection of how developed or primitive a society is. This just blows up that old evolutionary idea that some societies have simple minds. The hardware for complex thought is a human constant.
So we're going to end with this question for you. Mudimbe gives us this incredible critical tool. He shows us how a story, an entire narrative about a continent, was constructed. And it really makes you wonder what other big ideas that we take for granted about our history, about science, about who we are, what other inventions are shaping our world that we've just learned to accept as reality.